Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well in COM 709. I've really enjoyed getting to keep up with all the discussions that have been happening. Even though I don't get on there and comment, I've really been spurred in my own thoughts by a lot of what you've said and have really appreciated seeing how different perspectives kind of bounce back and forth as we develop together. So I've enjoyed being in class with you. As Dr. Crawford mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking with you about one of the authors you're reading this week, Fred Craddock. The reason is because, as people in my cohort know, one of my passions and one of my research interests is homiletics and preaching. I preach for the Graymuir Church of Christ here in Columbia, Tennessee, so I'm preaching every week, but I'm also interested in the art and the rhetoric behind it. And so one of my interests that has really been something I've been able to sort of connect to my coursework is the difference between deductive and inductive preaching. And as you can probably tell if you're already reading Craddock, that he is going to be sort of, really when you're looking through a homiletical history of the last few decades, he is one of the primary voices for inductive preaching. I was laughing when I read, I think it was in Deborah's proposal, I had to laugh to myself because it was so right when you were talking about Walter Brueggemann and stated that you had spoke with a preacher who said everybody goes through a Brueggemann phase. I had to laugh because I can identify with that. Brueggemann is a prolific Old Testament scholar, and so going through a Master of Divinity program, when you start getting into the Old Testament, I was amazed at how much he'd written, the breadth of it, and how formative it's been. And I would also say that for a lot of preachers, they go through a Craddock phase, which is they're drawn to the storytelling that's there. They're drawn to the indirect method of communication that Craddock uses. And what I loved about this course last year was seeing the connections between Kierkegaard and Craddock. Now, of course, Craddock, he credits Kierkegaard with that sort of development. How do you make something strange? How do you say it in a way that makes it more unfamiliar to people who are living in a world that is seemingly saturated with these messages from Scripture? And so I'd like to share with you just a little bit about kind of what I've been able to discover and been interested in researching about Craddock, and tell you a little bit about his life that might give you some insight into what he writes. He was born in Humboldt, Tennessee, and I grew up in West Tennessee area in Memphis, and so Humboldt's not too far from there. But he would not naturally have been a preacher. He didn't have a loud voice, and at the time when he was growing up, he states in his autobiography that preachers were known for loud voices and for sort of a booming voice from the pulpit, and that was not something he had. In fact, he tells the story of going to a preaching class and a seminary professor asking him to start over because he couldn't hear a word of what he said. And so he'd go out to the fields and he'd preach to the cows because if he thought if he could get the cows to look up at him, then he could preach loud enough to be heard in an auditorium. But another thing that happened as he started developing his preaching style took place actually in a church building in Columbia. As he describes in Connecting the Dots, his autobiography, he began to find out when he was preaching for a church that the building is still there, it's right on the square here in Columbia, that he would have more people's attention in the fellowship hall when he was telling stories after a potluck than he would when he was standing up and preaching. And so he began to experiment with this idea of how could he take something that in common vernacular at the time was sort of associated with lying, telling a story. How could he take something that had that negative connotation but use it in a way that magnifies the sermon? And so that led to this inductive approach. And for Craddock, it existed more in practice before it existed in theory. And so a lot of what we're reading when we read Overhearing the Gospel or some of the later works that he has about preaching, it exists as a result of him making the effort to articulate what he was doing that was working and why it was working. And so in the 1968 to 69 academic year, he makes a trip to Germany, a sabbatical leave, where he wants to study under Erman Diem, but discovers he's been forced to retire, and he's dealing with alcoholism and some other things. But one conversation he had with him, Diem said, study Kierkegaard. And that helped Craddock make the connection from practice to theory. And so, like a lot of us, he came at it from the other angle. He came at it trying to figure out, how can I clarify what's working? What's interesting to note about Craddock is he also, because of his seminary background and his training and experience as a teacher, he is also an expositor of Scripture. He has, before he really got into publishing in the area of preaching, he was publishing in areas of the biblical text. For example, the Interpretation Commentary series, which is known for its scholarly merit, had Craddock do the Philippians commentary. And so he did a lot of research there and a lot of work there, but later would become sort of best known for his preaching. He wrote a book, As One Without Authority, and then kind of a textbook on preaching called, fittingly, Preaching. But he has a great deal of work that's been done after that. And one of the things that I enjoyed in writing the paper is getting into those primary sources, reading not only his published collections of sermons, but even journal articles he had published where he'll include different facets of his approach and then a sermon that exemplifies it. And that's one piece of advice that I'm sure we all know, but just a reminder as you do your paper, getting in those primary sources, being able to read through, and obviously we can't read everything. I've already mentioned Brueggemann. I mean, he's published more books than I think I've probably read. I mean, he has all kinds of writings, so you have to really narrow the source material in some cases. But getting into those primary sources is really helpful. Now, there's a lot about Craddock's inductive approach that also coincided well with just the state of our nation at the time. And so when he starts really practicing this in the 70s and 80s, we've also gone through a societal shift in the late 60s, early 70s, and people are exploring different ideas, and there is an appetite for not being as traditional. And at the time, too, we had more biblical literacy in the world in which we lived. So for my particular paper, I was looking at the constraint in our cultural discourse of biblical literacy, using Bitzer's areas of a communication event, sort of requirements and rhetorical constraints. If one of those constraints is the fact that we have less biblical knowledge than we used to, well, how does that change the inductive approach? And so one of the things that is a question that has to be asked, I think, and other people have, I'm certainly not the first one who asked that question. Like a lot of research ideas, I thought I was till I started reading people. But is, how do I use Craddock's approach that wouldn't begin in a traditional deductive way, saying, here's what I'm going to say, I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you what I told you. For him, it's more like the top end of a funnel. And he's going to start here with the story here and there and there, and then it's going to funnel down until you have one point at the end that everything was building up to, but you don't know that point ahead of time. And many of Craddock's sermons end in a way that is prompting and even forcing the listener to be engaged, because the listener is going to have to draw his or her own conclusion. Now, that's a powerful way to build tension in a sermon. That's a powerful way to engage people and help them think through a sermon. But the question is, what if you're not dealing with people who know the text? What if you're dealing with people who, as you tell a story that sounds like a biblical story, they don't realize it sounds like a biblical story because they don't know the story to begin with? And even towards the end of his life, he addressed that. In an interview I read with him, he stated that one of the things he did towards the end of his life, when he would go around different places and he would speak for them, he would request that they had a combined Bible class, and he would just teach a straight Bible class through whatever the text was he was going to preach on. That way he knew they would have a solid foundation of what that text said, so when he preached, he could use that indirect approach, that indirect communication where you're overhearing this message and you're making these connections for yourself, and he would know they had that baseline of biblical knowledge. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting approach, and just a reminder that as he was developing it, he was cognizant of the time in which he lived. By the way, I think this is one reason that ministers go through a Craddock phase, is because ministers are familiar with the text and they've read the text. And so to hear someone or to read someone who's able to take it and, as he would say, to make it strange, to create some of that distance between the reader and the text, even if that text is familiar, to sort of push them back and let them view it from a different angle. Ministers really love that. And the challenge comes when a minister who's familiar with the text and really loves Craddock's style is in a context where people don't know the text of Scripture. And so it's not going to land the same way if they don't have that baseline knowledge. And it's important, too, to note as you read through Craddock, he is making the argument for indirect communication and inductive preaching. But from nothing I read could I ever say he thought this is the way you have to do it every time. In fact, in one of his later books, Craddock on the Craft of Preaching, in an interview, he said, you can't preach the same way every time, just like you can't win every race with the same horse. And so he built in room for different approaches. And so as we think about the way what he's writing and what we're reading this week fits in with kind of the changing landscape at the time of preaching and the impact he has, it's worth it to note that there are some other critiques that have been made of his inductive preaching approach that I think are worth pointing out. In fact, Thomas Long, who was one of really Craddock's students and proteges and has really continued to pioneer that approach, even he wrote an article, and I heard him lecture a few years ago in person, where he acknowledged some of the challenges that have been raised. There are some critiques that others have made. For instance, James Thompson wrote a book entitled Preaching Like Paul a few years ago that Long and others list, but he points to the fact that this kind of preaching functions, number one, best in a Christian culture in which listeners are well informed of Christian heritage. He states that there are times when the inductive approach can focus on technique to the neglect of a clear understanding of preaching. And much of the literature in New Homiletics treats narrative as primary, if not the only mode of discourse for preaching. And so here's one of the challenges if you're looking at Craddock's approach. That works very well for the narrative portions of Scripture, but not all Scripture is narrative. And so how do you adjust to that? The challenge is also there are times when narrative preaching can be reluctant to speak with authority or make concrete demands for change. And others that Thompson offers, the exclusive reliance on inductive preaching will not build or sustain communities of faith, which may be one of the more serious challenges that he makes, and that preaching as rational persuasion is not an alien intrusion into a mode of communication that was originally narrative in nature. And I think that last statement also connects to what we've been reading in Penner. It's this tension between, okay, is communication supposed to be narrative? Is there a place for rational persuasion? And I would say one of the reasons that Craddock's approach carries weight today and can have an impact today is because we live in a world that's increasingly reluctant to engage in any sort of argument that's designed for rational persuasion. I'm going to convince you. As some mentioned in our discussion board, we live in a world that's much more open to invitational rhetoric, saying, well, let's learn this together, rather than I want to teach you something. Here are the 3 points of what I believe. Now, again, anytime you're talking about preaching, you're eventually going to have to come to persuasion. You can't avoid that forever. But I think there's some insights here from the back and forth between Craddock and Thompson. So as we read that, as we think about it, I just want us to note the impact that Craddock has had on homiletics, to know that no, the inductive approach is not without its critics, but it was, I think, an important development and an important voice to be heard, and still is important for preachers to understand and to consider. I'm not a naturally inductive person. I'm very analytical. I sort of fall into, I guess, a more traditional category of preaching. And so when I was going through my MDiv program and went through my Craddock phase, I think it did really help broaden my horizons and force me out of my comfort zone to try different things. And I have found that if there are certain sermons that I feel like lend themselves really well to this kind of approach, and I try to design my sermon with that in mind, I will have different people comment afterwards than usually do. And so there definitely are personalities that are hit with this approach that you might miss otherwise. So that's a little insight into Craddock and kind of my research interest in him. I think that you'll find, if you ever get a chance to read some of the examples of his sermons, you can find several in different journal articles, but also if you look through he's got a few different books out that collect his sermons, but really reading through those really gives you a sense of what he is and what he does. And I will try to post also a link to one of his sermons that is probably the most well-known that he did, When the Roll is Called Down Here. So I know you've got plenty of extra time, but if you listen to it, it's a really good example of the mode that Craddock is going for, and what it is that he contributes. And even though he won't sound like a traditional preacher, listening to that sermon, I usually get chills by the end of it because of the skillful way that he's used the inductive method. So I'll put that link there as well for you to check out. Hope you have a great week, and look forward to continuing this class together with you.